My uncle rewrote Grandma's $300,000 will. He said, "It's all mine now." The family's shocking reaction to my revenge. I grew up in a small town just outside of Chicago, in one of those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business. And, believe me, my family had a lot of business to know. On the outside, we were the close-knit, classic Midwestern family, all smiles and Sunday dinners. But underneath, we were a mess, an intricate web of grudges, favoritism, and quiet resentments, especially when it came to my Uncle Brian. For as long as I can remember, Grandma June was the glue holding us all together. She'd worked her entire life as a school secretary, scrimping and saving every penny. Over the years, Grandma made a few smart investments, nothing flashy, but they grew into a nice little nest egg. She was never one to brag about money, but we all knew she was comfortable, modestly wealthy, as she'd say. "I don't need much, Johnny," she'd tell me with a soft chuckle, sipping her endless supply of mint tea. "Just enough to leave a little for each of you." Now, my mom was an only child, but she was very close to her cousin, Brian. Grandma June practically raised them both, so even though Brian wasn't my mom's brother by blood, we called him Uncle Brian. Grandma treated him like her own son, and for years, he took full advantage of it. Brian had always been a black sheep in the worst way. He'd gone through a revolving door of jobs and women, each one leaving him deeper in debt or in legal trouble. He wasn't a bad guy exactly, just weak. A gambler, a schemer, the kind of person who made promises he couldn't keep and expected everyone else to clean up his messes. And Grandma June was his number one enabler. "Mom," my mom would say, hands on her hips, "you can't keep bailing him out like this. He's never going to learn if you don't stop coddling him." Grandma would just shake her head, an exhausted look on her face. "He's family, Marcy. Family's all we have." But I knew the truth. Grandma June was afraid. Afraid that if she stopped helping him, he'd disappear from her life. She had a soft spot for him that defied all logic. So, when Grandma's health started declining, Uncle Brian swooped in, playing the dutiful son. He suddenly had all the time in the world to drive her to doctor's appointments, help with groceries, fix things around her house. I visited when I could, but I had a job and a family of my own. Brian, on the other hand, was there constantly, practically living at her house. It didn't take long for me to start noticing little things. Grandma's wedding ring, she wore it every day of her life, was suddenly missing. "Oh, I must have misplaced it," she'd say, waving me off. Her checkbook would have random expenses, cash withdrawals she couldn't account for. But the worst was the day I came over, and she pulled me aside, looking uncomfortable. "Johnny, I need to ask you something," she said, her hands fidgeting with her frayed old cardigan. "Brian says, well, he says I should rewrite my will. You know, simplify things." "What do you mean, simplify things?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. She looked away, biting her lip. "He thinks maybe it would be easier if everything just went to him. He's the one taking care of me, after all." I nearly choked. "Easier? Grandma, that's your entire estate. You've always said you wanted to split it between the family. This doesn't sound like you." She sighed, looking down at her wrinkled hands. "I don't know, Johnny. I'm tired. I'm tired of the fighting, the mess. I just want peace." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice calm. "Grandma, are you sure Brian isn't pressuring you into this?" She hesitated, just for a second, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear? Doubt? But then, she straightened up and shook her head. No. It's just easier this way." I didn't press her that day, but I walked out of her house with a sick feeling in my stomach. A few weeks later, we got the call that Grandma had passed away in her sleep. It was like a gut punch. I'd always thought we had more time. She'd seemed frail but steady, and I hadn't prepared myself for the suddenness of her loss. My mom was devastated, and I was barely holding it together myself. At the funeral, Brian put on a show like I'd never seen before. He sobbed, clung to every mourner who walked by, acting like he was the one who'd lost the most. It was nauseating. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe he really was grieving. But deep down, I knew he was just putting on a performance. 2 weeks later, we all gathered in the lawyer's office for the reading of the will. My mom and I sat on one side, while Brian sat alone, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, reading from a neatly stapled document. "To my grandson, Johnny, I leave my collection of photo albums and family heirlooms, with all my love." He looked up at me with a sympathetic smile, and I felt my heart sink a little. I'd always known Grandma would leave me something sentimental, but I hadn't realized just how much I'd been hoping for a share of her estate. Not out of greed, but because I knew how much she'd wanted to leave a legacy for all of us. The lawyer continued, and the room grew tense. "To my daughter Marcy, I leave a sum of $5,000, with the remainder of my estate, including all assets, to my nephew Brian." Mom gasped. "What? That can't be right." Brian sat back, crossing his arms and smirking. She knew who really cared about her. I was there every day. You were too busy living your life. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, glancing between us. The will was updated about 3 months before Mrs. June's passing. It's all legal, properly signed and notarized. I couldn't believe it. I turned to Brian, my voice low and furious. You manipulated her. You took advantage of her when she was vulnerable. He shrugged, still smirking. Maybe you should have been there more often, Johnny. You could have helped her, too. My mom looked at him, eyes brimming with tears. Brian, we were there for her. We trusted that you were actually doing this for her, not for yourself. How could you do this? He rolled his eyes. Spare me the tears, Marcy. You've had your life together since day one. I've had to scrape by. She knew I needed it more. Needed? I shouted, standing up. You're a grown man. You blew every dollar you ever had, and now you're taking everything from the family? The lawyer raised a hand, trying to keep things civil. I understand this is an emotional time, but there's little I can do. The will was revised and is legally binding. Mom started sobbing quietly, and I felt my own rage building. Brian was staring at us, that smug look never leaving his face. I wanted to throw something at him, shake him, make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd just caused us. But I held back, focusing on my mom, trying to comfort her. As we left, Brian called after us, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Guess you'll just have to get used to it, Johnny. Not everyone's as lucky as you. I stopped in my tracks, turning back to face him. You might have taken Grandma's money, but mark my words, Brian. You'll regret this. One day, this is all going to come back to bite you. He just laughed, waving us off like we were nothing more than a couple of annoying flies. The days that followed were the worst of my life. Everyone in town seemed to know about the will, and rumors flew. Somehow, Brian managed to spin the story, painting me and my mom as greedy, ungrateful family members who hadn't cared enough to support Grandma when she needed us. He even started telling people we'd been after her money for years, which couldn't have been further from the truth. I felt trapped, surrounded by whispers and judgmental stares. The betrayal cut deep, and every time I thought about Grandma, my heart ached. I'd trusted her to see through Brian's manipulation, but in the end, he'd managed to twist even her unwavering love. I tried to move on, but something wouldn't let me. There were too many loose ends, too many questions. It didn't feel like justice, it didn't even feel like closure. And then, just when I was starting to give up hope, I found something, a series of old letters Grandma had left behind, tucked away in a dusty old shoebox in her closet. The letters were from years ago, some addressed to my mom, some to Brian, and a few that looked like unsent drafts. But one letter caught my eye, dated just a few weeks before her passing. In it, she wrote about her regrets, her worries about Brian's intentions, and her confusion about changing the will. She hadn't wanted to hurt us, she wrote, but Brian had insisted. As I read those words, a fire lit up inside me. I realized that Brian hadn't just taken Grandma's money, he'd taken her dignity, her sense of trust, her legacy. And now, armed with her own words, I knew what I had to do. Finding Grandma's letters was like uncovering a buried treasure chest of her true thoughts. Each letter laid out the doubts and the pressure she'd felt, and the lengths to which Brian had gone to manipulate her. She'd left breadcrumbs, though, small, almost desperate pleas for us to understand what had happened, even if she hadn't been able to stop it. My hands trembled as I read the final note, a draft that she'd never sent, addressed to my mom. Marcy, I'm so sorry. Brian's insisting I make this change. He says it's what's fair, that he's the one looking after me. But something doesn't sit right in my heart. Please forgive me. I don't know if I'm strong enough to stand up to him. I feel trapped. That was all I needed. My mind was set. Grandma may not have been able to protect herself from him, but I could. I was going to make sure Brian paid for every bit of pain he'd caused her, and us. The next day, I took the letters to my lawyer, Phil. He was a close family friend, someone I trusted implicitly. Phil was as shocked as I was to read Grandma's final words. Johnny, these letters could help contest the will, Phil said, eyebrows raised as he flipped through the notes. But we're going to need more. A judge might not take them as concrete proof unless we can show a clear pattern of manipulation. I nodded, fully prepared to dig up every last shred of dirt I could on Brian. I spent weeks doing research, reaching out to anyone who'd ever crossed paths with him. I talked to old friends, ex-girlfriends, former employers, even people from his gambling circles. It wasn't hard to find people with stories of Brian's deceit and manipulation. As it turned out, he'd been a master manipulator for years, leaving a trail of burned bridges and broken promises. One night, just as I was getting ready to wrap up another late-night research session, I found an old document tucked in a forgotten drawer in Grandma's house. It was a power of attorney form, dated around the same time as the revised will. Brian had somehow convinced Grandma to sign it, giving him complete control over her finances. The document was wrinkled and worn, but the signature was unmistakably hers, shaky, almost hesitant. I showed the form to Phil, who whistled, looking impressed. "This is big, Johnny. If Brian pressured her to sign this, we can argue that he had undue influence over her financial decisions, including her will." It was the final piece of the puzzle. With Grandma's letters, the testimonies from Brian's past victims, and the power of attorney document, we had a solid case. Phil filed the paperwork to contest the will, and we prepared ourselves for a nasty court battle. The day of the trial came, and the courtroom buzzed with tension. Friends, distant relatives, even some old neighbors had come to watch the family feud unfold. Brian strutted in, his arrogance on full display. He flashed that same smirk at me and Mom as he took his seat, clearly confident that we didn't have a chance. The trial began with Brian's lawyer painting him as the devoted nephew who had sacrificed everything to care for Grandma in her final days. Brian even mustered a few fake tears, wiping his eyes and sighing dramatically as he talked about how hard it had been to lose her. I nearly choked on the bile rising in my throat. But then, it was our turn. Phil stood up and began presenting the evidence we'd gathered, piece by piece. He started with the testimonies from Brian's former friends and ex-girlfriends, detailing his history of manipulation and deceit. Each story painted a picture of a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, no matter who he hurt along the way. Then, Phil pulled out the power of attorney document, holding it up for everyone to see. This document gave Brian complete control over June's finances, signed shortly before her passing. We argue that this, along with the sudden change in her will, shows a clear pattern of undue influence. The judge leaned forward, examining the document closely. Brian's lawyer tried to argue that Grandma had willingly signed it, but then Phil pulled out the letters, the final blow. He read aloud from Grandma's letter, her shaky handwriting displayed on a screen for the entire courtroom to see. "I feel trapped." There was a hush in the room as Phil finished reading. I glanced over at Brian, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. When my mom took the stand, she spoke about her lifelong relationship with Grandma and how the sudden change in the will had devastated her. She described how Grandma had always spoken of dividing her estate fairly and how out of character it was for her to cut us out entirely. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Brian's lawyer tried to cross-examine her, but his questions fell flat. Everyone could see the truth: Brian had taken advantage of a vulnerable old woman. Finally, the judge called for a recess. I sat with Mom in the hallway, anxiously waiting for the verdict. Brian stormed past us, muttering under his breath. I caught just a few words, something about backstabbing family, and felt a surge of anger. But I kept my cool, knowing that the scales of justice were finally tipping in our favor. After what felt like an eternity, we were called back into the courtroom. The judge looked over the room, her expression stern. "After reviewing all the evidence, I have concluded that there was indeed undue influence exerted over Mrs. June. The will revision is hereby declared invalid, and the estate shall be divided according to the original terms." A collective gasp went up around the room. Mom squeezed my hand, tears streaming down her face. But I wasn't done. I'd already planned my next move. With the estate finally split fairly, Mom and I received our share of Grandma's money, but I couldn't let Brian off that easily. I wanted him to feel the consequences of his actions, something deeper than just losing out on Grandma's money. I knew that Brian had amassed a considerable amount of debt over the years, much of it with some unsavory characters in the gambling world. Using a bit of my inheritance, I hired a private investigator to discreetly spread the word about Brian's sudden windfall being revoked. Every creditor, every loan shark, every last person he owed money to would know that he had no way to pay them back now. Over the next few weeks, Brian's life unraveled in ways I hadn't even anticipated. His creditors started hounding him, his so-called friends vanished, and his reputation in town was left in ruins. People avoided him like the plague, whispers of his deceitful actions following him wherever he went. Then, one evening, I got a call from an old friend of Brian's, someone I'd spoken to during my investigation. "Johnny, you'll never believe this," he said, barely containing his laughter. Brian was seen hauling his stuff out of his apartment. "Looks like he's getting evicted." The image of Brian, once so smug and full of himself, lugging boxes out of his apartment alone, filled me with a grim sense of satisfaction. He'd taken everything from us, tried to steal Grandma's legacy, and now, he had nothing left. I haven't seen Brian in months now. Word has it he's living in a rundown trailer a few towns over, barely scraping by. He's tried reaching out to us a few times, leaving desperate voicemails and pitiful messages, but I haven't responded. Neither has my mom. We've moved on, finally able to remember Grandma without the shadow of his betrayal hanging over us. In the end, I realized revenge didn't need to be flashy or violent, it just needed to be fair. Brian had tried to rewrite Grandma's legacy, but in the end, all he did was rewrite his own. And as for me and my mom, we finally got the closure we needed. Grandma's legacy lived on, intact and untarnished, just as she would have wanted. And Brian? Well, he got exactly what he deserved.